Kael stood on the balcony of the observatory, her bare feet brushing against the cool, cloudy stone floor. The floating city of Elara hung high above the thick layers of the planet's atmosphere. A gentle breeze danced around her, slipping through the thin fabric of her dress, which hugged her soft curves tightly. It clung to her full chest, where tiny crystals sparkled like pearls, glowing faintly with each breath she took. Her skin shimmered a pale green under Elara's twin suns, catching the light and making it ripple like water over gems. Instead of hair, delicate vines grew from her scalp, woven with tiny purple flowers that swayed whenever the wind touched them, as if whispering a song only she could hear. The city around her was a wonder of the Voryn people. Towers made of crystallized clouds stretched upward, floating in the sky, held in place by massive energy crystals that hovered in the air. Below her feet, fluffy white clouds drifted lazily, sometimes parting to reveal glowing fields far beneath, where plants pulsed with light like little stars in the daytime. The soft hum of the crystals mixed with the breeze, creating a peaceful melody Kael had known for 300 years. This was her home, her world, a place where every breath felt connected to Elara's heartbeat. She leaned against the railing, her long, graceful hands sliding over its edge, feeling the cool touch of the crystallized stone against her fingertips. Her job was to study the energy crystals, living stones that powered the city and linked the Voryn to the universe. They weren't just tools. They were part of her, reflecting her emotions, her thoughts, and even the secret desires she rarely dared to admit. Kael closed her eyes, letting the wind brush her face, making the vines on her head sway like a slow dance. She felt alive in that moment, tied to the crystals, to Elara, to everything around her. She felt beautiful, not the grand beauty of Voryn legends, but a fragile, sensual beauty born from her harmony with nature. Yet deep inside, Kael felt an emptiness. 3 centuries on Elara had taught her patience, but it also left her longing for something more, a connection stronger than the quiet, endless days she'd lived. She lifted a hand to her chest, touching the largest crystal nestled between her breasts, feeling it hum softly under her fingers. It was warm, alive, almost like it was speaking to her, whispering about things she'd never dared to dream of. The breeze grew stronger, tugging at her dress, and she opened her eyes, staring out at the endless sky. The twin suns painted the clouds gold and pink, and for a moment, she imagined someone out there, someone beyond Elara, reaching for her, pulling her into a warmth she'd never known. Kael stepped into the small lab inside the observatory, where a giant energy crystal floated in the air, glowing with a soft blue light. She slipped off her outer dress, letting it fall to the floor, leaving only a thin layer of fabric clinging to her shimmering skin. The cool air brushed against her, making the tiny crystals on her chest and hips sparkle like stars. This was her daily ritual, connecting with the crystal to check its energy. But today, something felt different, like a hidden wave stirring inside her. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the smooth surface of the crystal. Instantly, a warm rush flowed from her fingertips, spreading up her arm, down her spine, and blooming through her whole body like a hot stream. Kael arched slightly, her lips parting as a soft moan escaped, so quiet it barely reached her own ears. Her breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling under the thin fabric, the largest crystal on her body flaring bright, casting flickers of light across the walls like a dance of desire. It wasn't just energy, it was pleasure, a melting of her body into the crystal, as if she were dissolving into the universe itself. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation take over. Images flashed in her mind, strong hands, not Voryn hands, touching her, gripping her waist, pulling her close in an embrace she'd never felt in real life. It was Marcus, the human she'd saved 50 years ago, a memory she tried to bury but couldn't escape. She remembered his warmth, how his solid body pressed against hers as she gave him energy to survive, how his breath had brushed her neck, hot and alive. His eyes had locked onto hers back then, deep and hungry, a look she hadn't dared to answer. Kael's eyes fluttered open, her breath still uneven. She pulled her hand back from the crystal, but the warmth lingered on her skin, sending a shiver through her. She wondered if she was craving something beyond what a Voryn should want. A connection not just through crystals, but through flesh, through breath, through touches she only dared to dream of in moments like this. She stepped back to the balcony, leaning against the railing, hoping the wind would cool the fire smoldering inside her. But it only made her feel emptier, the breeze teasing her skin, tugging at the vines on her head, whispering promises she couldn't grasp. The peace of Elara shattered with a boom that shook the sky. Kael flinched, her head snapping up to look outside. Through the thick layers of clouds, dark shapes emerged. Huge, twisted ships of the Zykar fleet, their metal tentacles wriggling like living things. They plunged downward, fast and ruthless, like predators hunting prey. Bright flashes of red light burst from their sides, hitting the cloud towers around her. Another explosion roared, closer this time, making the floor tremble beneath her bare feet. Kael stumbled back inside, her heart pounding hard in her chest. She grabbed her thin outer dress from the floor, but before she could pull it on, a shock wave slammed through the observatory. She fell hard, hitting the ground with a gasp. The giant crystal in the lab shook wildly, its soft blue glow flickering like it was crying out. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the wall for balance, and ran toward the hallway. But what she saw outside stopped her cold. The beautiful towers of crystallized clouds were crumbling, breaking apart and falling like heavy rain. Below, the white clouds tore open, swallowed by bursts of fire and black smoke. Screams echoed through the air, her people, the Voryn, crying out as their world burned. She forced herself to move, running down the hallway as fast as she could. The air grew thick with mist from the shattered clouds, soaking her skin and clothes. Her thin dress stuck to her body, clinging wetly to her curves, showing every shimmer of her crystal-covered skin in the dim light. Sweat dripped down her face, mixing with the dampness, plastering the vines on her head to her neck and shoulders. Her chest heaved with every ragged breath, the largest crystal between her breasts glowing faintly, as if struggling to stay alive. She'd faced danger before in her long life, but never like this. Never so helpless, so fragile. A smaller Zykar ship swooped low, its metal tentacles smashing through the observatory wall. Shards of cloudstone flew everywhere, and Kael ducked, tumbling to the floor. Thick, choking smoke poured in, stinging her eyes and throat. She coughed hard, tears blurring her vision, but she crawled forward, aiming for the stairs to the lower level. Through a broken window, she caught glimpses of horror. Voryn running through the streets below, their glowing bodies swallowed by flames or crushed under falling debris. Some didn't even have time to scream. Her hands gripped the jagged edge of the broken stair railing as she slid downward, her bare feet scraping against sharp pieces of shattered crystal. Pain shot through her legs, but she ignored it, pushing herself into a dark corner at the bottom. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her lungs burned, and her body trembled, soaked from head to toe. The mist and smoke swirled around her, turning her shimmering skin into a faint glow in the chaos. She could barely see through the haze, but she heard the deep, growling hum of the Zykar ships growing louder. Peering out, Kael saw a massive ship descend closer, its hull splitting open to release the Zykar themselves. They weren't machines. They were creatures tall and thin, with bony bodies covered in writhing tentacles. Their eyes glowed red like pools of blood, scanning the ruins for anything alive. These weren't soldiers fighting for a cause. They were hunters, driven by instinct to kill and destroy. Kael's stomach twisted as one of them turned its head toward her hiding spot, its tentacles twitching like it could smell her fear. She shrank back, hugging her arms around herself. The largest crystal on her chest pulsed weakly, as if it shared her terror. Her mind raced, screaming one question over and over. Why now? For 300 years, Elara had been her sanctuary, a place of quiet beauty and endless calm. Now it was gone, ripped apart in moments, leaving her alone in a nightmare she didn't know how to face. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay still, to stay quiet, but the sounds of destruction grew closer. Crashing towers, roaring engines, and the sharp, wet shrieks of a Zykar as they hunted. Another explosion rocked the building, sending dust and shards raining down. Kael threw herself flat, covering her head as the ceiling cracked above her. Her wet dress clung tighter, cold against her skin, and her vines tangled around her neck like they were trying to choke her. She crawled again, dragging herself through the rubble, her hands shaking as they brushed over sharp edges. Blood mixed with the water on her skin, trickling from small cuts, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. If she did, they'd find her. She reached a small alcove, a shadow in the wall, and curled up inside, pulling her knees to her chest. Her breathing was loud in her ears, too loud, and she pressed a hand over her mouth to muffle it. Through the smoke, she saw a Zykar creature stalk past, its tentacles dragging across the ground, leaving slimy trails. It paused, turning its head slowly, and Kael held her breath, her whole body trembling. The crystal on her chest dimmed, as if hiding with her. After what felt like forever, the creature moved on, disappearing into the fog. Kael let out a shaky breath, her hand dropping to her side. She didn't know how long she could hide, or if there was anywhere left to run. The observatory, her home, was collapsing around her piece by piece. The city she loved was dying, and she was trapped in the middle, a fragile figure in a storm she couldn't fight. She pressed her forehead against the wall, the cold stone grounding her for a moment. But even that couldn't stop the fear clawing at her heart, or the desperate hope flickering inside her. A hope that someone, might save her from this. Kael crouched in the dark alcove, her back pressed against the cold, jagged wall of the crumbling observatory. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp sting of burning clouds, making her chest ache with every shallow breath. Her thin dress, soaked from mist and sweat, clung to her skin, outlining the curves of her trembling body. The tiny crystals embedded in her flesh flickered weakly, their light dimming as if they, too, felt the weight of the destruction outside. She hugged her knees tight, her long fingers digging into her legs, trying to stop the shaking that wouldn't go away. The sounds of the Zykar attack, crashing towers, screeching ships, and distant screams, echoed in her ears, but inside her mind, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. She closed her eyes, her head tilting back against the stone. For 300 years, Elara had been her sanctuary, a place where time moved slowly, where she could listen to the hum of the crystals and feel the heartbeat of her world. Now it was gone, torn apart by monsters she didn't understand. She'd always been patient, calm, steady, like all Voryn, but now that calm was slipping away, leaving her raw and exposed. Fear clawed at her insides, sharp and unfamiliar, and with it came something else, a deep, aching loneliness she'd buried for decades. In this moment, hiding from death, she felt more alone than she ever had in her long life. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to a memory from 50 years ago, a moment she tried to forget but couldn't. It was on a trading station far from Elara, a cold, metal place filled with strange beings from across the galaxy. She'd been there to study alien crystals, her hands full of glowing samples, when she'd heard a cry, a human cry, weak and desperate. Kael had followed the sound, her vines swaying with each step, until she found him. Marcus, a young human man, trapped in a wrecked ship. His body was bruised, his clothes torn, and his dark eyes wide with panic as a jagged piece of metal pinned him down. She'd acted without thinking, her Voryn instincts pushing her to help. She knelt beside him, her hands brushing his arm as she pulled the debris away. His skin was warm, rougher than hers, and alive in a way that startled her. He'd been too weak to move, his breath shallow, so she'd done what only a Voryn could. She'd given him her energy. Kael pressed her body against his, her chest molding to his, her arms wrapping around him tightly. She felt the largest crystal on her chest flare up, its light spilling over them both as she poured life into him. His heartbeat thudded against her, strong and fast, and his heat seeped into her shimmering skin, making her shiver. Their faces were so close she could feel his breath on her cheek, hot and ragged, stirring the vines on her head. His hands, trembling, gripped her shoulders, fingers digging into her soft flesh, as if she were his only anchor. She'd never been that close to anyone before. Not a Voryn, not an alien, not a human. The sensation overwhelmed her, his warmth, his scent, the way his chest rose and fell against hers. For a moment, she'd forgotten the danger, lost in the raw connection between them. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and deep, and she saw something there, gratitude, yes, but also a hunger, a need that made her heart skip. When his strength returned, she pulled back, her body tingling where they'd touched. He'd whispered something. His name, Marcus, his voice low and rough, sending a strange thrill down her spine. She'd helped him stand, her hands lingering on his arms longer than they needed to, feeling the hard lines of his muscles under her fingers. Then she'd left, returning to Elara, telling herself it was just a small act, nothing more. But the memory stayed with her, haunting her quiet nights, filling her with a longing she didn't understand. Now, curled up in the ruins of her home, that memory flooded back, sharp and vivid. Kael pressed a hand to her chest, where the crystal still pulsed faintly. She could almost feel him again, his heat, his grip, the way his breath had brushed her skin. She wondered where he was now, if he even remembered her. Humans didn't live long, not like Voryn. 50 years was half a lifetime for them. Maybe he was gone, his dark eyes closed forever, and she'd never know. The thought made her throat tighten, a lump forming she couldn't swallow down. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and mixing with the dampness on her face. She'd saved him, but who would save her now? Elara was dying, her people were dying, and she was trapped, powerless to stop it. The Zykar didn't care about her crystals, her knowledge, her life. They'd crush her like they'd crushed everything else. She buried her face in her hands, her vines tangling around her fingers, and let out a quiet sob. For the first time in centuries, she felt small, fragile, like the wind could blow her away. But then a spark flickered in her mind, a desperate, crazy idea. Marcus, the humans. They weren't part of the Galactic Alliance, not bound by its cold rules. She'd save one of them once. Maybe, just maybe, they'd remember. Her hand slid to a small device on her wrist, a communicator she rarely used. It was old, scratched, but it might still work. She didn't know if anyone would hear her, or if they'd care, but it was all she had left, a tiny thread of hope in the darkness swallowing her world. Kael's trembling fingers brushed the communicator on her wrist, the cold metal a sharp contrast to her warm, damp skin. She sat huddled in the alcove, the smoky ruins of the observatory pressing in around her. The sounds of the Zykar attack rumbled outside, distant booms and the shrieks of collapsing towers. But here, in this tiny pocket of shadow, it was just her fear, and the faint hope flickering in her chest. She needed to reach someone, anyone, and her mind clung to one name, Marcus, the human she'd saved, the one whose touch still burned in her memory. Her breath hitched as she fumbled with her soaked dress. It clung to her like a second skin, heavy with mist and sweat, trapping her in its wet embrace. She couldn't think straight with it sticking to her, so she tugged at the thin fabric, peeling it off her shoulders. It slid down slowly, catching on the curves of her body before falling to the floor with a soft, wet thud. The cool air hit her bare skin, making her shiver. Her shimmering flesh glowed faintly, the tiny crystals on her chest and hips catching what little light filtered through the smoke. She sat there, exposed, her full breasts rising and falling with each quick breath, the largest crystal between them pulsing like a heartbeat. Kael leaned back against the wall, her hands shaking as she lifted the communicator to her lips. She didn't know if it would work or if the signal could pierce the chaos outside, but she had to try. She pressed the button, and a faint static hum buzzed in the silence. Her eyes closed, and she pictured Marcus, his strong hands, his rough voice, the way his body had pressed against hers all those years ago. The memory sent a warm flush through her, starting at her chest and spreading downward, making her skin tingle despite the cold. "Marcus," she whispered into the device, her voice soft and shaky, almost a plea. She paused, swallowing hard, then spoke again, louder this time. "This is Kael from Elara. I don't know if you're out there, or if you even remember me." Her lips trembled, and she bit them gently, tasting the salt of her own sweat. "I saved you once, 50 years ago, on that trading station. You were trapped, dying, and I held you." Her voice cracked, thick with emotion, and she pressed the communicator closer, as if it could carry her touch across the stars. She shifted, her bare back sliding against the rough stone, the sensation sending a shiver up her spine. Her free hand drifted to her chest, brushing the glowing crystal there. It flared under her fingers, warm and alive, just like it had when she'd saved him. She could still feel him, his hard chest against her soft one, his arms clutching her as she poured her energy into him. The heat of that moment flooded back, making her breath catch. She imagined his hands on her now, rough and strong, pulling her close, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered her name. The thought made her arch slightly, a quiet gasp escaping her lips, her body aching for a touch she'd never truly known. "If you hear this," she continued, her voice dropping to a husky murmur, "please come. Elara is falling. The Zykar are destroying everything, and I can't stop them alone." Her words trembled with desperation, but there was something else too, a longing, a passion she couldn't hide. "I don't know if you're still alive, or if you care, but I need you. I've always needed you." She stopped, her chest heaving, the confession hanging in the air like a secret she'd kept too long. Kael sat motionless in the alcove, her bare skin pressed against the cold stone, the communicator still clutched in her trembling hand. The faint static from her plea to Marcus buzzed softly before fading into silence. She didn't know if the message had reached him, or if it had been swallowed by the chaos outside. Her chest tightened, the largest crystal between her breasts glowing weakly, as if it, too, doubted anyone would come. The air around her was thick with smoke, heavy with the smell of burning clouds and shattered dreams. She pulled her knees closer, tried to make herself smaller, invisible, as the sounds of destruction grew louder. A deep rumble shook the observatory, rattling the walls and sending dust cascading down. Kael flinched, her vines brushing her face as she ducked her head. Through the cracks in the broken wall, she glimpsed the nightmare unfolding outside. The Zykar ships hovered like dark gods above the city, their twisted metal tentacles slashing through the air. One ship fired a beam of red light, and a nearby tower of crystallized clouds exploded, its pieces raining down into the swirling mist below. The glow of Elara's twin suns was gone, blotted out by black smoke and the shadows of death. Her home, her sanctuary, was being torn apart, and she could do nothing but watch. She shifted, peering out cautiously, her bare shoulders scraping the rough edge of the alcove. The movement sent a shiver through her soaked skin prickling in the cold. She saw movement below, Voryn running through the streets, their glowing bodies darting between piles of rubble. Some carried small crystals, clutching them like lifelines, but it didn't matter. A Zykar ship swooped low, its tentacles snapping out like whips. One Voryn, a woman with vines like Kael's, stumbled and fell. Before she could rise, a tentacle wrapped around her, lifting her into the air. Her scream cut through the noise, sharp and desperate, then stopped as the ship crushed her, her light snuffed out in an instant. Kael's stomach churned while rising in her throat. She pressed a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. Her people were dying, hundreds, maybe thousands, slaughtered by creatures that didn't even speak, didn't even care. The Zykar weren't here to conquer. They were here to hunt. She'd read about them in old records, their instinct-driven attacks on weaker worlds, but she'd never thought Elara would be next. The Galactic Alliance had promised protection, but where were they now? Nowhere. Silent, leaving her world to burn. A shadow moved closer, and Kael shrank back, her heart racing. Through the haze, she saw one of the Zykar creatures stalking the ruins of the observatory. It was tall and thin, its body a mix of bone and metal, with tentacles twitching from its sides. Its red eyes glowed like fire, scanning the darkness, and its jagged mouth opened and closed, dripping something dark and wet. It dragged a clawed hand across the floor, leaving deep scratches, and Kael held her breath, praying it wouldn't hear her. The crystal on her chest dimmed further, as if trying to hide her light. The creature paused, its head tilting, and for a moment she thought it had found her. But then it turned, lumbering away, its tentacles slithering behind it. She exhaled shakily, her body trembling harder now. The alcove felt like a trap, the walls closing in, but she couldn't move, not yet. Another explosion rocked the building, closer this time, and the ceiling above her cracked loudly. She threw herself flat, curling into a ball as chunks of stone crashed down around her. Dust stung her eyes, and she coughed, her throat raw. Her bare skin was streaked with dirt and blood from small cuts, her vines tangled and heavy with grime. She felt exposed, helpless, like prey waiting to be caught. Kael crawled forward, her hands shaking as she pushed through the rubble. She needed a better hiding spot, somewhere safer, but everything was falling apart. The floor tilted suddenly, a section collapsing under the weight of a fallen beam. She scrambled back, her nails scraping the stone, and pressed herself against the wall again. Her chest heaved, each breath a struggle, and tears streamed down her face, mixing with the filth. She'd never felt this weak before, not in 300 years. The Voryn were supposed to be strong, connected to their world, but now that world was dying, and she was dying with it. She glanced at the communicator in her hand, its scratched surface barely visible in the dim light. Had Marcus heard her? Would he come? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. The Zykar were everywhere, above her, below her, tearing through what was left of Elara. She saw another ship land in the distance, its doors splitting open to release more of the creatures. They spread out, their red eyes cutting through the smoke, hunting anything that moved. Kael's hope flickered, fragile and fading. Even if Marcus got her message, what could he do? He was human, small and short-lived, not a warrior from some mighty fleet. Yet she clung to the thought of him, the only thing keeping her from breaking completely. Kael huddled in the crumbling alcove, her bare skin scraped and cold against the jagged stone. The Zykar were everywhere now, their screeches cutting through the smoke-filled air as they tore apart what was left of the observatory. Her communicator lay silent in her hand, its faint static long gone, and with it, the fragile hope she'd pinned on Marcus. She pressed her forehead to her knees, her vines damp and tangled around her face, her chest tight with despair. The ground shook again, a deep rumble that made her teeth chatter. She didn't know how much longer she could hide, or if there was even a point to it anymore. A sharp, buzzing sound pierced the chaos, growing louder, closer. Kael's head snapped up, her eyes wide as she peered through the haze. It wasn't the growl of a Zykar ship. It was different, higher-pitched, like a swarm of angry insects. She crawled forward, peeking out from her hiding spot, her heart pounding. Through the smoke, she saw it, a sleek, metal shape dropping from the sky, streaking downward with a trail of fire behind it. It wasn't Zykar. Its lines were too smooth, too human-made. Her breath caught. Could it be? The object? No, a ship, slammed into the ground just beyond the observatory, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. The impact shook the floor, sending Kael tumbling backward with a gasp. She scrambled to her knees, clutching the wall, her crystals flickering as she stared at the crash site. The buzzing faded, replaced by a hiss of steam and the groan of straining metal. Then, a hatch burst open, and a figure stepped out, moving fast despite the chaos. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his body wrapped in a tight suit that hugged his muscles. His face was hidden behind a helmet, but something about him, the way he stood, the confidence in his stride, felt familiar. Before Kael could process it, a Zykar creature lunged from the shadows, its tentacles whipping toward the man. She froze, her hand flying to her mouth. The thing was huge, its bony body glistening with slime, its red eyes locked on its new prey. But the man didn't hesitate. He ducked, rolling to the side as a tentacle smashed into the ground where he'd been. In one fluid motion, he pulled a weapon from his hip, a small, sleek gun, and fired. A blinding flash lit up the darkness, and the Zykar shrieked, its body jerking before collapsing in a heap, smoke curling from charred remains. Kael's eyes widened, her breath shallow. The man turned, scanning the area, his weapon still raised. Then his helmet tilted toward her hiding spot, and she shrank back, her heart racing. He'd seen her, she was sure of it. She didn't know whether to run or stay, her body trembling with fear and a strange, wild hope. He started toward her, his boots crunching over the rubble, his figure cutting through the smoke like a blade. As he got closer, his helmet slid back with a soft hiss, revealing a face, human, rugged, with dark eyes and a jaw set hard with determination. It was him, Marcus, Kael. His voice was deep, rough, cutting through the noise like a lifeline. He stopped a few steps away, his gaze locking onto her. Kael of Elara? She stared, her lips parting but no sound coming out. It was impossible. He couldn't be here, not after 50 years, not in the middle of this hell. But those eyes, those same dark, intense eyes she'd seen all those years ago, held her, pulling her back to that moment when she'd saved him. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, it's me. He didn't waste time. He closed the distance in 2 strides, dropping to one knee beside her. His gloved hand reached for her arm, strong and steady, pulling her up from the alcove. We need to move now, he said, his tone sharp but not harsh. His grip was firm, his warmth seeping through the fabric of his glove, and it sent a jolt through her shivering body. She stumbled to her feet, her legs weak from fear and exhaustion, but he held her up, his arms sliding around her waist to steady her. Another Zykar screeched nearby, its shadow looming through the smoke. Marcus spun, shoving Kael behind him with one hand while raising his gun with the other. The creature charged, its tentacles lashing out, but he fired again, 2 quick shots, and it crumpled mid-stride, its body twitching before going still. Kael clung to his back, her fingers digging into his suit, her breath ragged against his shoulder. She felt the heat of him, the solid strength of his body shielding her, and it made her head spin. Come on, he barked, turning to grab her hand. He pulled her forward, dragging her through the wreckage toward his ship. Her bare feet stumbled over sharp stones, pain shooting up her legs, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not with him here, not with the Zykar closing in. The air was thick with dust and the stench of burning metal. But Marcus moved like he knew exactly where to go, his grip on her hand unbreakable. They reached the ship, a small, battered thing, its hull scarred from the crash. The hatch was still open, and he pushed her inside, his hands firm on her hips as he lifted her up. She landed on the metal floor, her knees buckling, and he jumped in after her, slamming a button to seal the door shut. The ship hummed to life, its engines roaring as it shook beneath them. Kael collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving, her crystals glowing faintly in the dim light of the cabin. Marcus dropped into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. Hold on, he said, not looking back. The ship lurched, rising fast, and Kael gripped a strap on the wall as the force pinned her in place. Through a scratched window, she saw the ground fall away, the ruins of the observatory, the Zykar swarming below, their red eyes glaring up at the escaping ship. Another explosion rocked the air, a Zykar beam missing them by inches, and the ship tilted sharply, throwing Kael against the wall with a groan. Marcus cursed under his breath, wrestling the controls to steady the ship. "Damn it, they're not giving up," he muttered, his voice tight. He glanced over his shoulder at her, his dark eyes meeting hers for a split second. "You okay?" She nodded, too breathless to speak, her body aching but alive. The ship climbed higher, breaking through the smoke into the upper layers of Elara's sky. Kael stared at Marcus, his broad back hunched over the controls, his hands steady despite the chaos. He'd come. After all these years, he'd heard her call and come for her. Her heart pounded, not just from fear, but from something deeper, something she hadn't felt since that day she'd held him in her arms. The small ship shuddered as it climbed higher, breaking free of Elara's smoke-choked sky. Kael slumped against the cold metal wall of the cabin, her bare skin prickling from the chill and the adrenaline still coursing through her. Her chest heaved, each breath a struggle, and the faint glow of her crystals pulsed unevenly, mirroring her racing heart. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive, and it was because of him. Marcus, the human she'd called out to in desperation, the one whose voice had pulled her from the edge of despair. He sat in the pilot's seat, his broad shoulders tense as he wrestled with the controls. The ship jolted again, a sharp turn to dodge something Kael couldn't see, and she gripped the strap tighter, her knuckles whitening. Then, with a final hum, the engine steadied, and the cabin grew quieter. Marcus let out a low breath, his hands easing off the controls, and turned to look at her. His helmet was off now, resting on the console, and his face was fully visible, rugged, weathered, but unmistakably him. Those dark eyes found hers, sharp and searching, and Kael felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough but soft, cutting through the hum of the ship. He stood, moving toward her with a steady stride, and Kael realized she was still sitting there, half-naked, her wet dress left behind in the rubble. Her arms crossed over her chest instinctively, hiding the largest crystal that glowed between her breasts. But his gaze didn't waver. It stayed on her face, intense and unreadable. I'm fine," she stammered, her voice shaky. But she wasn't fine. Her legs ached, her skin was scratched and bruised, and her whole body trembled from exhaustion and shock. Marcus didn't argue. He knelt in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the icy metal around them. His gloved hand reached out, hovering over her arm, and then he pulled the glove off with his teeth, tossing it aside. His bare hand, rough, calloused, warm, touched her skin, and Kael gasped softly, the sensation jolting through her like a spark. He froze, his eyes flicking up to meet hers, but he didn't pull away. "Sorry," he muttered, though his hand stayed where it was, resting gently on her arm. "Just checking you're not bleeding too bad." His fingers slid down slowly, brushing over a cut on her forearm, and Kael felt her breath hitch. His touch was careful but firm, and it sent a wave of warmth spreading through her, waking up the crystals on her skin. They glowed brighter, casting faint light across his face, highlighting the lines of his jaw, the faint scar on his cheek. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ship's hum. Her hand moved without thinking, reaching for his, her long fingers brushing his knuckles. He didn't flinch, his grip tightened instead, pulling her closer, and suddenly his other arm was around her waist, steadying her as she swayed. His palm pressed against the small of her back, strong and hot through her shimmering skin, and Kael arched into him, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. "I heard you," he said, his breath warm against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "Your voice." Damn it, Kael, it cut through everything. His words were low, rough, and they vibrated through her, stirring something deep inside. She tilted her head, her vines brushing his shoulder, and their faces were so close now she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint sweat and metal on his skin. His hand slid up her back, fingers splaying wide, and she felt every inch of that touch, every rough edge, every pulse of warmth, as if he were claiming her right there. Her crystals flared brighter, bathing them in a soft, blue glow, and Kael's lips parted, a quiet moan slipping out before she could stop it. Marcus's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to her mouth for a heartbeat before snapping back up. 50 years, he murmured, his voice husky, and I never forgot you. That day you saved me. I felt you, Kael. Every damn second of it. His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her flush against him, her bare chest brushing the hard fabric of his suit. The contact sent a thrill through her, her body trembling not from fear now, but from something wilder, hotter. She stared into his eyes, lost in their depth, and her hand slid up to his shoulder, fingers digging into the muscle there. I felt you too, she breathed, her voice thick with emotion, with need. Your warmth, your strength. I've carried it with me all this time. Her vines tangled in his hair, brushing his neck, and he leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. His breath fanned over her lips, hot and unsteady, and Kael's whole body ached to close the gap, to taste him, to feel him in a way she'd only dreamed of. But then the ship jolted again, a harsh reminder of the danger still out there. Marcus pulled back slightly, his jaw tightening, though his hand stayed on her waist, firm and possessive. We're not safe yet, he said, his voice rough with restraint. But I've got you now. I'm not letting go. His eyes locked onto hers again, a promise burning in them, and Kael nodded, her heart pounding as the heat of his touch lingered on her skin. Kael sat against the wall of the small ship, her bare skin still tingling where Marcus had touched her. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady drone that couldn't drown out the pounding of her heart. She watched him as he turned back to the controls, his broad back filling the pilot's seat. He was human, solid, real, and so different from her. And yet he was here, in the middle of Elara's ruin, pulling her from the jaws of death. Her eyes traced him, taking in every detail, her mind spinning with the impossibility of it all. Marcus was bigger than she remembered, his body hardened by years she couldn't imagine. His suit hugged him tightly, stretching over wide shoulders and a chest that looked like it could break stone. The fabric clung to his arms, outlining thick muscles that flexed as he adjusted the ship's controls. She felt those arms around her just moments ago, strong and unyielding, lifting her like she weighed nothing. His hands, now bare without the gloves, moved with precision, rough, scarred, with knuckles that spoke of fights and hard work. They were hands that could kill a Zykar in one shot, yet they'd held her so gently, so carefully, that her crystals still glowed from the memory. His hair was dark, cropped short, with streaks of gray at the temples, proof of the 50 years that had passed since she'd saved him. It stuck to his forehead, damp with sweat from the crash and the fight, giving him a wild, untamed look. Kael's gaze drifted to his neck, thick and corded, where the suit's collar didn't quite cover. She could see the pulse there, steady and strong, and she wondered what it would feel like to press her fingers against it, to feel his life under her touch. His skin was tanned, rougher than her shimmering green, marked with faint scars that told stories she didn't know. When he spoke, his voice rumbled through the cabin, deep and gravelly, like the growl of a distant storm. We're clear for now, he said, half turning to glance at her. But they'll come after us again. That voice, low, commanding, with an edge that made her stomach tighten, hadn't changed. It was the same voice she'd heard all those years ago, weak then, but full of fight. Now it carried weight, a strength that matched the man he'd become. It vibrated through her, stirring the same heat she'd felt when he'd whispered her name. His face was the last thing she studied. Square jaw, sharp cheekbones, and those dark eyes that pinned her in place. They weren't soft, not like hers, but fierce, burning with something she couldn't name. A scar ran across his left cheek, thin and faded, and it only made him look more alive, more human. He was the opposite of her, where she was soft curves and fragile light. He was hard edges and raw power. Yet that contrast drew her in, made her want to reach out, to bridge the gap between them with her hands, her breath, her everything. Marcus shifted, catching her staring, and one corner of his mouth twitched, a hint of a smile, rough but warm. "You're tougher than you look," he said, his voice softening just enough to make her crystals flare. Kael didn't reply, too caught up in him. This man who'd crossed the stars to find her, who carried her memory in his scars and his strength. Kael sat in the cramped cabin of Marcus's ship, her bare legs tucked beneath her on the hard metal bench. The hum of the engines had settled into a low, steady rhythm, and the chaos of Elara's destruction felt far away now, swallowed by the vastness of space. Her skin still shimmered faintly, the tiny crystals catching the dim light, but she felt exposed without her dress, vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. She pulled her arms around herself, her vines brushing her shoulders, and watched Marcus as he checked a flickering screen on the console. His presence filled the small space, big, solid, real, and it made her heart ache with something she couldn't name. He turned from the controls, his dark eyes finding hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions, until Marcus leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his short, gray-streaked hair. "You're wondering why I'm here," he said, his voice low and rough, breaking the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. "Why a human would come all this way for a place like Elara." Kael nodded, her throat tight. She'd sent the message in desperation, a cry into the void, but she hadn't truly believed he'd hear it, let alone answer. "I thought maybe you'd forgotten me," she said softly, her voice trembling. 50 years is a long time for humans. "I didn't know if you were even alive." Marcus's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a second, his gaze settling on the scratched floor. 50 years is a long time, he agreed, his tone quieter now, almost heavy. "But forget you? Kael, I couldn't if I tried." He met her eyes again, and there was something raw there, something that made her breath catch. "That day on the trading station, you saved me. You didn't have to, but you did. And I've carried it with me every damn day since." She shifted, her hands tightening around her arms, the memory flooding back. She could still feel it, the press of his body against hers, the heat of him seeping into her skin as she'd given him her energy. It had been quick, desperate, but it had stayed with her, a quiet fire she'd never let burn out. "I held you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I felt your heart, your life. It was strong." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "You don't know what that did to me," he said, his voice dropping lower, rougher. "I was half dead, trapped in that wreck, and then you were there, soft, glowing like something out of a dream. You wrapped your arms around me, and I felt you, Kael. Not just the energy, but you. Your warmth, your breath on my neck, the way your chest pressed against mine. It woke me up, kept me alive." His eyes darkened, his fingers flexing as if he could still feel her under them. "I didn't know what you were, but I knew I'd never forget you." Kael's crystals flared faintly, her skin warming under his words. She remembered every second of that moment, his hands gripping her, his heartbeat thudding against her, the way his breath had stirred her vines. It had scared her then, how much she'd felt, how much she'd wanted to stay in that embrace. "I didn't think it meant so much to you," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought it was just a moment." A moment. Marcus let out a short, rough laugh, shaking his head. "Kael, was everything. I was a kid back then, barely 20, scared out of my mind. You didn't just save my life. You gave me a reason to keep going. I've spent 50 years chasing that feeling, trying to understand it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw you, your face, your light, the way you held me like I mattered." He paused, his gaze softening. "When your message came through, it was like a damn punch to the gut. I knew I had to find you." Her heart skipped, her chest tightening with a mix of shock and something warmer, deeper. She uncurled her arms, letting them fall to her sides, her crystals glowing brighter now. "You crossed the stars for me?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "For one Voryn, one memory?" Marcus stood, closing the small distance between them, and crouched in front of her again, just like he had after pulling her from the rubble. Not just a memory, he said, his voice firm but soft. A debt. A promise. You gave me a second chance, Kael, and I wasn't about to let you die down there. His hand hovered near her knee, hesitating, then rested there gently, his rough palm warm against her shimmering skin. And yeah, maybe it's more than that. Maybe I've been looking for you all this time. Kael's breath hitched, her body leaning toward him without thinking. His touch sent a shiver through her, waking up the crystals along her leg, their light dancing across his face. She stared at him, at the lines etched into his skin, the strength in his frame, and felt that old fire flare up again, stronger now, undeniable. I never forgot you either, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Every time I touched a crystal, I thought of you. Your heat, your hands. I wondered if I'd ever feel it again. His fingers tightened slightly on her knee, his eyes locking onto hers, dark and burning. You're feeling it now, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. And I'm not going anywhere until you're safe. The promise hung between them, heavy and real, and Kael felt her walls crumble, her longing spilling out in the glow of her crystals. Kael followed Marcus through the narrow hatch into a tiny room at the back of the ship, her bare feet padding softly against the cold metal floor. He'd called it a med bay, though it was little more than a cramped space with a bench, a flickering light, and a few battered supplies stacked in the corner. The air here was warmer, heavier, and it pressed against her shimmering skin as she stepped inside. Marcus closed the hatch behind them, the click of the lock echoing in the small space. And suddenly it was just the two of them, the hum of the ship fading into a distant murmur. Sit, he said, his voice low and steady, nodding toward the bench. Kael obeyed, easing herself down, her vines brushing the wall as she settled. Her body ached. Cuts and bruises stung her legs and arms, but it was the closeness of him that made her pulse race. He stood over her, tall and solid, his suit stretched tight across his chest. He pulled off his other glove, tossing it aside, and Kael watched his hands, rough, strong, human, flex as he reached for a small kit on the shelf. You've got some nasty scratches, he muttered, crouching in front of her again, his knees brushing hers. He opened the kit, pulling out a cloth and a bottle of something clear, but his eyes flicked up to her face, lingering there. I need to check you over, make sure nothing's worse than it looks. His tone was practical, but there was a roughness to it, a tension that made her crystals glow a little brighter. Kael nodded, her throat dry. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely carrying in the tight space. He started with her arm, dabbing the cloth against the cut, and she flinched at the sting, her breath catching. His touch was gentle but firm, his fingers steady as they brushed her skin, leaving trails of warmth in their wake. She watched him, the way his dark brows furrowed in focus, the way his jaw tightened every time she winced. He was so close now, close enough that she could feel the heat rolling off him, smell the faint tang of sweat and metal on his skin. He moved to her shoulder, then paused, his hand hovering near her chest. This one's deeper, he said, his voice dropping lower, almost a growl. His eyes met hers, asking permission, and Kael's heart skipped. She nodded again, slower this time, and he reached out, his rough fingers brushing the edge of the largest crystal nestled between her breasts. The contact sent a jolt through her, sharp and electric, and she gasped, her back arching slightly against the wall. Marcus froze, his hand stilling, but he didn't pull away. Does it hurt? He asked, his voice husky, his breath warm against her face. Kael shook her head, her lips parting as she tried to find words. No, she breathed, it's fine. But it wasn't fine, it was overwhelming. His touch woke the crystal, its glow flaring bright, spilling light across his scarred hand, his rugged face. His fingers slid slowly, carefully, tracing the edge of the cut near the crystal, and Kael felt every inch of it, every rough callus, every press of heat, like a fire spreading through her. Her eyes fluttered shut, a soft moan escaping her lips before she could stop it. The sound hung between them, thick and heavy, and when she opened her eyes, Marcus was staring at her, his dark gaze intense, unblinking. His hand stayed where it was, pressed against her skin, and she felt his breath quicken, brushing her cheek in short, hot bursts. "You're still beautiful," he murmured, his voice so low it vibrated through her. "Just like that day, glowing alive. I couldn't get you out of my head." Kael's chest heaved, her crystals pulsing with every word. She leaned forward, drawn to him, her hand reaching up to touch his face. Her fingers brushed his jaw, rough with stubble, and he tilted his head into her touch, his eyes half closing. His hand slid higher, cupping the side of her chest, his thumb grazing the crystal, and she shivered, her breath mingling with his. They were so close now, lips inches apart, noses brushing, the air between them charged with heat and want. "I thought of you too," she whispered, her voice trembling with longing. "Every time I felt alone, I remembered your hands, your warmth." Her fingers tightened on his jaw, pulling him closer, and his grip on her tightened too, his palm pressing harder against her skin. She could feel his heartbeat through his touch, strong and fast, matching hers, and it made her ache for more, for all of him. The ship jolted suddenly, breaking the spell, and Marcus pulled back just enough to steady them both, his hand still on her. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "We got time, Kael. I'm not done with you yet." The promise in his words sent a thrill through her, her crystals glowing brighter, and she nodded, her body still humming from his touch. Kael stood beside Marcus as the small ship shuddered to a stop, its engines whining down to a low hum. The hatch hissed open, revealing a massive, sprawling structure floating in the void beyond Elara's atmosphere. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sight of the mining station, what Marcus called the mother ship. It wasn't sleek or graceful like the Voryn cities. It was a hulking beast of metal, patched together with rough plates and jagged edges, glowing with orange lights from countless windows. Pipes and cranes jutted out like limbs, and smaller ships buzzed around it, darting in and out of gaping docking bays. It looked alive, chaotic, a human creation born from grit and survival. Marcus led her out, his hand brushing her elbow to guide her. Her bare feet felt the cold, gritty floor of the station, a sharp contrast to the smooth clouds of Elara. The air here was thick with the smell of oil and metal, buzzing with distant clangs and shouts. Kael's crystals flickered, catching the dim light, and she pulled her arms around herself, feeling small in this strange, noisy world. Marcus glanced at her, his dark eyes softening for a moment. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. "This place isn't pretty, but it's ours." They stepped onto a walkway overlooking the main deck, and Kael stopped, her breath catching. Below her stretched a vast chamber, filled with machines and people. Humans, all of them, moving with purpose. Giant drills and cutters hung from the ceiling, their metal teeth gleaming, while workers in patched suits hauled crates or shouted orders. Screens flickered on the walls, showing maps and blinking dots. Zykar ships, she realized, still swarming near Elara. The station wasn't just a refuge. It was a fortress, a hive of activity, fighting to hold its own. Marcus leaned on the railing beside her, his broad frame casting a shadow over her. "This is a mining rig," he explained, his voice cutting through the noise. "We pull ore from asteroids, scrape by out here in the black. Wasn't built for war, but we've made it work." He pointed to a cluster of smaller ships launching from a bay, their engines flaring bright. "Those are our fighters, old haulers rigged with guns. Not much, but they hit hard." Kael's eyes followed the ships as they streaked toward the dark shapes on the screens. Zykar vessels, their twisted forms barely visible against the stars. A flash lit up the display, followed by a burst of static, and she flinched. "They're fighting them?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For Elara?" "For you," Marcus corrected, his tone rough but steady. "When your message came through, I rallied everyone I could. Told them about the Voryn who saved me, about what you did. They didn't have to listen, but they did." He nodded toward the deck below, where a group of humans cheered as a fighter returned, its hull scorched but intact. "We're not soldiers, Kael. We're miners, scavengers. But we don't leave debts unpaid." She stared at the scene, her chest tightening with a mix of awe and guilt. The humans moved like a swarm, chaotic but united, their machines roaring as they pushed back the Zykar. Another explosion flared on the screen, a Zykar ship breaking apart, its pieces scattering into the void, and a cheer rose from the deck. Kael's crystals glowed faintly, reflecting her growing hope, but she couldn't shake the weight of it. These people, with their patched ships and rough hands, were risking everything because of her, because of one moment 50 years ago. Her gaze drifted to Marcus, standing solid beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. The station's orange light caught the gray in his hair, the scars on his knuckles, and she saw the toll of those years. Years he'd spent fighting, surviving, remembering her. "You built this?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the clamor. He shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Not alone. Took a lot of stubborn bastards to keep it running. But yeah, this is home." He turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers, and the smirk faded. "When I heard you, Kael, I knew we had to come. This rig's all we've got, but it's enough to give those Zykar hell." A loud clang echoed through the station, and the floor vibrated as a fighter landed hard in the bay below. Kael gripped the railing, her vines brushing Marcus's arm, and she felt the heat of him even through his suit. Outside, the battle raged on. Flashes of light, streaks of fire, the Zykar's dark shapes clashing with the humans' ragged fleet. She couldn't see Elara anymore, just the black of space and the fight unfolding in it, but she felt it, her world hanging in the balance, defended by people she'd never met. Marcus's hand rested on the railing beside hers, close enough that their fingers almost touched. "We'll hold them off," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For as long as it takes." Kael looked at him, at the strength in his frame, the resolve in his eyes, and felt a flicker of something new, trust, maybe, or hope, warming her from the inside. Kael stood beside Marcus on the observation deck of the mining station, her bare feet planted on the scratched metal floor. The massive window in front of them stretched wide, offering a clear view of the black void and the battle raging beyond. Her crystals glowed faintly, reflecting the orange lights of the station, but her eyes were fixed on the chaos outside. Flashes of fire, streaks of smoke, and the jagged shapes of Zykar ships clashing with the humans' patched-together fleet. The air buzzed with tension, the deck below vibrating with the shouts of miners-turned-warriors and the roar of launching fighters. Marcus gripped the railing, his knuckles white, his dark eyes scanning the screens mounted above the window. "They're pushing hard," he muttered, his voice tight. "But we've got them on the run." Kael glanced at him, his broad frame tense but steady, and felt a surge of something, trust, maybe, or faith, in the man who'd brought this ragtag army to save her world. She stepped closer, her vines brushing his arm, and he didn't pull away. A bright explosion lit up the void, and Kael flinched, her hand flying to her chest. On the screen, a Zykar ship split apart, its tentacles flailing as it broke into pieces, scattering into the darkness. A cheer erupted from the deck below, echoing up to where they stood. "That's one down," a voice shouted, rough and triumphant, and Marcus's lips twitched into a grim smile. "Keep hitting them," he said into a small comm device on his wrist. "Don't let up." The humans fought like they lived, messy, fierce, unrelenting. Kael watched as their fighters, old mining haulers rigged with cannons, darted between the Zykar ships, firing bursts of light that punched through metal and bone. One hauler took a hit, spinning wildly before crashing into a Zykar vessel, taking it down in a fireball. She gasped, her crystals flaring, and Marcus's hand brushed hers on the railing, steadying her. "They know what's at stake," he said, his voice low. "They're not backing down." Another Zykar ship loomed closer, its red eyes glowing through the smoke, and Kael's stomach twisted. It fired a beam, a streak of red cutting toward the station, and the whole deck shook as it grazed the hull. Alarms blared, red lights flashing, and Marcus cursed, slamming a fist on the railing. "Brace!" he barked, his arms sliding around her waist to hold her steady. She pressed against him, her body trembling, the heat of his grip grounding her as the station rocked. Below, the humans scrambled, miners hauling weapons, pilots racing to their ships. A trio of fighters launched, weaving through the chaos to meet the Zykar head-on. They fired together, a coordinated blast that tore through the enemy ship's core. It shuddered, then burst apart in a shower of sparks and debris, the red eyes fading into nothing. The deck erupted again, louder this time, a roar of victory that vibrated through Kael's bones. She exhaled, her chest heaving, and Marcus's grip on her tightened for a moment before easing. "They're breaking," he said, nodding toward the window. Kael followed his gaze, her eyes widening. The Zykar fleet, what was left of it, was scattering, their ships retreating into the void, chased by the humans' relentless fire. The miners didn't stop, their fighters pursuing the enemy until the last dark shape vanished from the screens. The alarms quieted, replaced by a wave of cheers and laughter, raw and exhausted but alive. Marcus turned to her, his face softening, sweat beading on his brow. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with relief. "We've got them." Kael stared at him, then back at the window, her breath catching as the smoke cleared. Below, Elara's atmosphere shimmered into view, still scarred, still broken in places but alive. The twin suns peeked through the clouds, casting gold and pink across the floating cities, some still standing, defiant against the ruin. Her world wasn't gone. It was healing. She stepped closer to the glass, her hand pressing against it, the cold biting her palm. "You did this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved it." The humans had fought, not with sleek warships or grand armies, but with grit and heart, and they'd won. For her, for Elara. Her crystals glowed brighter, spilling light across the deck, and she felt tears prick her eyes, warm and heavy. Marcus joined her, his shoulder brushing hers, his presence solid and warm. "We did it," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "You called, and we answered." He pointed out the window, where a few fighters circled back, their hulls battered but proud. "Those people down there, they heard your voice too. They fought for you, Kael, because you gave me a reason to fight all those years ago." She turned to him, her gaze locking onto his dark eyes, and saw the truth there, 50 years of carrying her, of turning one moment into a lifeline. The station hummed around them, alive with victory, and Kael felt Elara's heartbeat echo in her own chest, faint but growing stronger. They'd won. Against all odds, they'd won. Kael stood beside Marcus on the observation deck, the vast window framing the slowly healing glow of Elara below. The cheers from the mining station's crew had faded into a quiet hum of celebration, leaving the two of them alone with the stars and the soft pulse of the ship. Her bare skin still shimmered in the orange light, her crystals glowing brighter now, reflecting the hope swelling in her chest. She turned to Marcus, his broad figure steady beside her, his dark eyes fixed on her world, her home, saved by his hands and his people. The weight of it all pressed against her, gratitude and something deeper, hotter, stirring beneath her surface. She stepped closer, her vines brushing his arm, and he turned to face her, his rugged features softening in the dim light. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, trembling with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You gave me back my world." Her hand hovered near his, hesitating, then rested lightly on his wrist, her long fingers brushing his rough skin. The contact sent a shiver through her, her crystals flaring, and she saw his breath hitch, his eyes darkening as they met hers. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice a deep rumble, rough but warm. "I owed you. 50 years, Kael. I carried that debt every day." His hand turned under hers, his palm pressing against her fingers, and she felt the heat of him, the strength that had pulled her from the ruins. It was familiar, like that day so long ago, but stronger now, more real. She shook her head, her vines swaying gently. "It's more than a debt," she whispered, her voice thick with feeling. "You didn't just save me. You saved everything I am." Her free hand moved to her chest, fingers brushing the largest crystal nestle between her breasts. It pulsed under her touch, warm and alive, and she knew what she had to do, what she wanted to do. "I want you to have something," she said, her gaze locking onto his. "A part of me." Marcus's brow furrowed, but he didn't speak, watching as her fingers pressed harder against the crystal. A soft glow spread from it, and with a small, sharp breath, she pulled it free, slowly, carefully, like plucking a star from her skin. It came loose with a faint shimmer, leaving a dull ache in its place, but she didn't care. The crystal rested in her palm, small but radiant, pulsing with her energy, her life. She held it out to him, her hand trembling slightly, and his eyes widened, a flicker of awe breaking through his hard exterior. "Kael," he started, his voice rough, but she stepped closer, cutting him off. She took his hand, turning it palm up, and placed the crystal there, her fingers lingering on his skin. His hand was warm, calloused, so different from hers, and the contrast made her pulse race. She didn't stop there. Her body moved on its own, drawn to him, and she bent forward, bringing his hand to her lips. She pressed a slow, soft kiss to the back of it, right where his knuckles met the crystal, her breath warm against his skin. Marcus froze, a low sound catching in his throat, and Kael felt him tense under her touch. Her lips lingered, soft and deliberate, tasting the salt of his sweat, the roughness of his scars. Her vines brushed his wrist, curling slightly, and she exhaled against him, her breath hot and unsteady. "This is me," she murmured, her voice a husky whisper, "forever yours." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, a promise wrapped in longing. His fingers curled around the crystal, his grip tightening, and she looked up, meeting his gaze. His dark eyes burned with something fierce, desire, yes, but also a tenderness that made her chest ache. He lifted his other hand, brushing it along her jaw, his thumb grazing her lips, and Kael shivered, her crystals glowing so bright they lit up his face. "You're giving me this?" he asked, his voice low and thick, almost disbelieving. "After everything?" She nodded, leaning into his touch, her skin humming where he held her. "Because of everything," she said, her breath mingling with his. "You brought me back, Marcus. You gave me hope." Her hand slid up his arm, fingers digging into the muscle there, feeling the strength that had carried her through the fire. He pulled her closer, his hand slipping to the back of her neck, and for a moment she thought he'd kiss her, his lips so near, his breath hot against her face, but he stopped, his jaw clenching with restraint. "I don't deserve it," he muttered, his voice rough with emotion, "but I'll keep it. Always." His fingers tightened in her vines, pulling gently, and Kael felt her body arch toward him, her chest brushing his. The air between them crackled, thick with want, but he held back, his eyes searching hers. "You're something else, Kael," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "and I'm not letting you go that easy." She smiled back, small but real, her crystals pulsing with the heat of him. The moment stretched, intimate and electric, until a distant clang from the station broke it, reminding them of the world outside. But even then, his hand stayed on her, warm and steady, a tether she didn't want to lose. Kael stood on the edge of the mining station's docking bay, her bare feet cold against the metal as she watched Marcus prepare his small ship. The massive window behind her framed Elara, its clouds glowing softly under the twin suns, a fragile beauty rising from the ashes of the Zykar's attack. The station buzzed with activity, miners repairing fighters, shouting orders, celebrating their hard-won victory. But here, in this quiet corner, it was just her and him. Her crystals shimmered faintly, their light dimmer now, as if they felt the weight of what was coming. Marcus turned to her, his rugged face softened by the glow of the bay's lights. He held the crystal she'd given him in his hand, its faint pulse matching the rhythm of her own heartbeat. "We've cleared the Zykar out," he said, his voice low and steady, though there was a roughness to it, a hint of reluctance. "Elara's safe now. Time for me to get this crew back to work. Mining's all we know." He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes, and Kael felt a pang in her chest, sharp and sudden. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. She'd known this moment would come. Humans didn't stay, not like Voryn, but hearing it still cut deeper than she'd expected. Her hand brushed the empty spot on her chest where the crystal had been, a dull ache lingering there, and she wondered if he felt it too. He nodded, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the floor. "Yeah, got to. This rig's not built for sitting still." His dark eyes locked onto hers, fierce and warm, and he reached out, his rough hand cupping her face. "But I'll be back, Kael. You got my word." His thumb brushed her cheek, sending a shiver through her, and her crystals flared briefly, lighting up the space between them. She leaned into his touch, her vines brushing his wrist, and closed her eyes for a moment, memorizing the feel of him, his warmth, his strength, the way he made her feel alive. "I'll wait," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For you." When she opened her eyes, he was still there, closer now, his breath warm against her lips, and she thought he might kiss her. But he pulled back, his jaw tightening, and she saw the restraint in him, the battle he fought to let her go. He stepped away, his hand dropping to his side, the crystal clutched tight in his fist. "Take care of Elara," he said, his voice rougher now, almost hoarse. "And yourself." He turned to the ship, climbing in with a heavy stride, and Kael watched, her chest aching as the hatch hissed shut behind him. The engines roared to life, and the small craft lifted off, joining the swarm of fighters heading back into the void. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, until it disappeared from sight, a speck swallowed by the stars. A shuttle waited to take her back to Elara, and Kael boarded it in silence, her vines trailing behind her. The trip was short, the pilot, a quiet human with tired eyes, saying little as they descended through the clouds. When they landed, she stepped out onto a field of floating mist, the air cool and familiar against her skin. The cities of Elara stretched before her, scarred but standing, their towers glinting under the suns. Survivors moved among the ruins, their glowing forms faint but alive, rebuilding what they could. It was home, her home, saved by Marcus and his people. Kael walked to the edge of the field, her feet sinking into the soft, living clouds, and looked up at the sky. The mining station was gone now, a distant memory against the vastness, and with it, Marcus. Her hand pressed her chest again, the empty space where her crystal had been a quiet void. She felt hollow, like a piece of her had left with him, carried in his scarred hand across the stars. The wind tugged at her vines, cool and gentle, but it couldn't fill the emptiness inside her. Yet beneath that emptiness, there was warmth, a lingering echo of his touch, his voice, his promise. She closed her eyes, and the memory came back sharp and clear, his hands on her waist, his breath against her ear, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. It wasn't gone. It lived in her, a fire she'd carry as long as she breathed. Her crystals pulsed faintly, a soft glow against the dusk, and she smiled, small but real. Kael opened her eyes, gazing at the stars where he'd disappeared. He'd come back. He'd said so, and she believed him. Until then, she'd rebuild Elara, hold it together, keep it alive for the day he returned. The wind whispered through her vines, carrying the promise of that future, and she stood there, alone but not lonely, her heart tethered to a human somewhere out there in the black.